Hello, everyone, and welcome to your lecture on the future of food. Now, I feel a little silly even having a lecture on this because who can predict the future? No one knows what the world will be like in 25 years, and if you look back 25 years previously, no one could have expected where we are today. So if you talk to someone who went to high school in the 90s, would they have been able to predict the internet? Could your great-grandmother have predicted the microwave? In the future, will we be using food replicators to conjure up food out of thin air? Or will we be eating slop that tastes like what we think chicken should taste like? It's really impossible to know. That's why this class is training you to be critical thinkers, not just functioning automatons with factual knowledge, but able to think and plan ahead for this unpredictable future. So we can use some of the lessons learned in this class to assess some of the trends that we foresee in the near future and at least give you some perspective on what the future of food might be. So to start with perspective, I just want to give you a very brief history of the restaurant. The restaurant is actually only, at least in the US, only about 200 years old. It goes back maybe another 100 years in France. But what I mean by restaurant is this place that makes food with separate tables for people to eat at and a menu to choose from. So this is different from like a tavern and an inn where you sit down at a common table, it's family style dining, and you get to eat whatever the cook made for dinner that night. Can you imagine a world without restaurants? If the first restaurant was Delmonico's, it opened in New York in 1827, so 200 years ago about. That's not that long ago. Can you imagine if you were unable to order pizza delivery or you couldn't take your family out for a celebration? The world we live in now of convenience food and takeout food and food delivered to your doorstep, we are living in the future already. Another thing that's changed vastly in the last 100, more like 50 years really, was after World War II, the birth of the chain restaurant really became a staple in the American life. So Howard Johnson's, that's this middle picture. The picture on the left, that's one of the dining rooms at Delmonico's when it opened. Howard Johnson's was one of the first chain restaurants nationally recognized in the U.S. It was incredibly popular. At the height of its popularity in the 70s, they had more than 1,000 restaurants, and it was the biggest food chain in America, and only the Army fed more people at the time. You might never have even heard of Howard Johnson's, but again, ask your grandparents, ask your great-grandparents, did they ever go to Hojo's, have I think it was deep-fried clams? Probably at a turnpike. The growth in this branded restaurant coincided with the rise of the car and the highway system, and the ability for the middle class to take family holidays. And when you go to an unfamiliar location, where do you want to eat? Somewhere you can trust. And people trusted Howard Johnson's. So each franchise in the Howard Johnson's universe had to adhere by the Howard Johnson's Bible, which dictated everything from decor to the amount of tartar sauce on their food, and they had to use food specially prepared by central commissaries, which was delivered to the restaurant for final cooking. So they really were one of the pioneers in this concept of restaurants branding for reliability and the experience of going there. And a lot of fast food restaurants that are still operating today continue to operate under this business model. Again, imagine traveling across the US by car, and every town you stop in has its unique locally owned restaurant. There are no chains. There's no McDonald's or Jack in the Box or Howard Johnson's. One of the trends that's been happening this century has been blamed on millennials, like a lot of things are, is this fast food versus slow food dichotomy. And so there's been a response to this fast food branded idea of stability and reliability in the food to embrace slowing down and patience for your food. It'll be interesting to see how this idea integrates into our increasing reliability on convenience foods to have meals when and where we can instead of lacking the tools and the ability to make food quickly. But some other recent firsts you might not be aware of is that the first cooking shows really started in the 1940s. The Julia Child, the French chef series that started in the 60s was really the beginning of popular cooking shows on TV. You know, the Food Network started operating in the 90s, and I think, again, it's hard to imagine a world where food television doesn't exist. The first cooking quote-unquote website, 1982. Before then, you couldn't get a recipe online. There was no online. You had to get a cookbook. And if you've ever subscribed or known someone who subscribed to a meal kit service like HelloFresh or Blue Apron, those both got started in 2012. So less than 10 years old. And even food items that we take for granted, like the Honeycrisp apple, although it was developed in the 60s and patented in 1988, it didn't really hit markets until the 1990s. So the Honeycrisp apple may be something that just barely predates yourself, or it might have been something that was developed during your lifetime. A fun note about the Honeycrisp. It's expensive because they're not bred to store or ship well. They're bred for taste, which is why so many people do prefer the flavor of a Honeycrisp apple, even though oftentimes they can be twice as expensive as other apples because of all of the waste and food loss that happens growing and shipping them. But I'd like to look back at these historical trends to get some perspective on where the future might be going. If you look at the modern American diet, we eat more than we used to, more average daily calories per capita, and we eat more grains and fats and oils than we used to, comparing U.S. In 2010 to U.S. in 1970. Americans are eating more chicken and less beef than we used to. We drink less milk, especially less whole milk, and eat less ice cream, but we do consume way more cheese than we did in 1970. And our diets include less sugar than in previous decades, but more corn-derived sweeteners like high fructose corn syrup. So while we consume about 23% more calories than we did in 1970, almost half of those come from just two food groups, flours and grains. And these are not linear trends. You know, it's not, we're eating less sugar than we used to. We peaked of our sugar consumption in 1999, actually, when each person consumed an average of 90 pounds of caloric sweeteners a year, or 27 teaspoons a day. By 2014, sweetener use was down to 77 pounds per year. So this is another way to look at those trends if you want to pause the video and see what we're eating less of and what we're eating more of than we did in 1970. Another interesting thing that these graphs don't show is that about 10% more of our food that we eat is prepared away from the home. So this is food bought at restaurants or convenience foods bought at grocery stores. So we're doing less cooking. And even though people are depending more on foods prepared away from the home, we're overall spending less on food than we did 60 years ago. So now, on average, about 10% of our disposable income is spent on food, and it was closer to 18% of our disposable income back in 1960. One of the reasons why this is the case is that staples like soybeans, sugar, and wheat are all cheaper than they were decades ago, but some things cost more, like beef and eggs. And of course, not every American household is the same. And if you look at income brackets, you can see that some people are still spending as much proportionally on food as Americans were 100 years ago. So the highest income bracket does spend more on food, but proportionally, this is the people on the far right here, they only spend about 8% of their income on food. Folks in the lowest income bracket, however, are spending about a third of their income on food. And this actually follows global trends that advanced countries, we don't like to say developed, we might say high GDP countries, spend less proportionally on food, but the share of spending has been declining across rich and poor countries. Okay, so if people are spending less on food, we're eating slightly more food away from home. We have a lot more tools like the internet at our disposal to affect how we cook and eat. What do we think the future of food will be like? Usually, short term predictions are just more of the same of current trends. So I call this the cultural ratchet. Humans tend to do best with incremental change. Dramatic shifts in food practices have happened, but most humans are much more comfortable with a change towards something that is slightly new. So a better microwave, a different type of can opener, looking a recipe up on the internet instead of in a cookbook. Some people love their new device, the Instant Pot, and some people are just so intimidated by the functions that they don't even use them because it's too much difference. So, what is more of the same that we expect to see? Well, there's a lot of bioengineering that goes into agricultural products to make crops resilient to weather shocks, to increase the traits in crops that we want, to make them more resilient to pests so we don't have to put so many pesticides on them. So, definitely more of this. This also probably includes protein breeding, so meat and fish, farming fish more responsibly. But one of the possibilities about meat is that it can be grown in the lab, and so instead of raising animals, one of the future trends that people are expecting to see is meat, lab-grown meat, so lab-grown protein. One of the trends that we're seeing currently is that we just have a lot more data about what animals are growing and doing and who's getting sick and why, and a lot more technology to deal with all of these changes also. So developing vaccines or breeds of pork that are resilient to different diseases. But as you can see, this is just more of the same of what we have already been doing. And I added onto this list Victory Gardens question mark because following the quarantine, a lot of people have become interested in raising their own food at home. So more home gardening, more local foods, possibly I'd put on the list of future foods as well. Now, you'll see a lot of flashy pieces about the future of food. Basically, they all boil down to changes in technology, policy, labor availability, and demand by the consumer. So I ask you, what do you do now? Because that is partially driving future food trends. You vote with your behavior. How do you choose, if you drink coffee, how do you choose to get your cup of coffee in the morning? All of the different options that you see here, your little Italian coffee pot, your Keurig, getting a to-go cup from Starbucks, or visiting a local coffee shop. All of these have ramifications for our food supply system. What kinds of beans are you getting? What kinds of people are working at these establishments? How are they handling food waste? I know it can seem so overwhelming when all you want to do is have your morning cup of coffee. So just when possible, be aware that the choices that you make have real life ramifications in the real world. So think if you can, think critically about your food choices and just be aware that your choices have impacts on the systems that get the food to your table. Consumer demand is a really strong player in changing food systems. You've all done some research now for your signature assignment. Has that changed the way you think about the recipe that you made and the ingredients that you use? What do you think the future of your recipe looks like in 5, 10, 50, 500 years? As we've been reading 8 Flavors, you've definitely noticed that flavors have changed, recipes have changed, and cooking in America has changed. Okay, so what might change, especially following all the upheaval of 2020? Possibly a return to local. Local usually means around 100 miles within, you're using a product that was produced within 100 miles of yourself. Sometimes it's up to 200, sometimes it's a little less. People define this differently. But maybe people will begin depending more on local food systems. When all the flour ran out at the grocery stores, the local bakeries in Boise still had flour on the shelves that you could buy. People may be, as I've said, doing more home production versus specialized systems. So there's been a lot of home bread baking going on instead of people going to the grocery store to buy bread. A lot of this has been experimentation. maybe a little home agritourism going on, but as the knowledge and skills to do things like bake a loaf of sourdough bread are revived, it might change the way that people think about buying bread at the store. And I noticed in the discussions that some of the students were really baffled by the concept of agritourism. And I'm talking about the ones who've grown up on or near farms. Like, why would you ever visit a farm? How boring is that? So perhaps as food systems become more localized and they become more parts of people's daily lives, agritourism might lose some of its appeal. We will see. I think there is so much left to be seen. Just pay attention as you go through your life, what changes in your food systems. Another broader trend that has been happening over the last couple of decades, I would say, is this desire for a return to natural food. Now, natural food, as you heard by our guest lecturer, is legally pretty hard to define. And so I asked the question, what is natural? If we want to return to these natural food products, where are we even going? Like the Best Buy and Use By labels, it's very poorly regulated, and it's not really indicative of much in the product. So the federal definition is that there's no artificial ingredients and minimal processing. But the federal rule neglects to really define what minimal is. And as a result, they haven't been able to come up with this definition for natural to encompass what consumers, producers, and processors all might think is natural or want labeled as natural. So this is a catch-up. It's labeled as 100% natural. Wonderful. And the label also lists that it has no high fructose corn syrup. Now, high fructose corn syrup can be included as an ingredient in foods labeled natural, but this flowchart diagram on the left you see here is the process by which, or one process by which high fructose corn syrup is created from corn. So I'll leave that up to you to decide whether you think that's minimal processing or not. It's poorly regulated, and I think it's a good question of what do we desire when we say we want something natural. Foods labeled as natural can charge more and make more money for producers, so there's definitely a desire for everyone to label foods as natural. Foods labeled as fresh are also mired in these legal difficulties of a one-size-fits-all definition for these concepts that maybe even people don't really know, can't put a finger on what they mean. And some of the futurists about food say that maybe this desire for naturalness hints at our desire to return to our roots, and that if we look at ancient foods, those are the food sources of the future. So there are 2,500 plant species domesticated for food, but half of the world's calories come from just 3 grains: wheat, maize, and rice. That's not the picture here. But ancient grains like quinoa, millet, and emmer wheat may be more regional solutions to increase local production and reliability and nutrition as well. If you look over the history of the human species, before the development of agriculture, people used to eat a lot more different foods and have a lot more diversity in their diet than we do now. And as populations increased and shifted to intensification and agriculture, there was a narrowing of the diet. And one key to resilience is often diversification. So it's a question of how do we reintroduce diversification into people's diets? There's big cultural barriers here, right? Do you know how to cook quinoa? How about millet? Are they part of your regular diet? Is there a dish? Oh, I just love millet. I eat it for breakfast or in stew, or how would you incorporate these things onto your plate fairly regularly? Would you deal with having more foods that you know how to cook and store and on the shelves in the grocery store? There's a lot of cultural barriers here to incorporating these, but they might be very good solutions regionally to increasing resilience of our food supply and increasing our nutrition profiles. So here's another big question about the future of food. Where are we going? We talked about breeding. We've talked about breeding tomatoes and citrus and other products in this class, what are people even breeding for in the very short term? What are you trying to achieve? We had a podcast at the beginning of the semester when you did your bitter taste test in discussion groups, and you listened to a discussion about breeding the bitterness out of Brussels sprouts and to encourage people to eat more Brussels sprouts. But perhaps those bitter compounds that make Brussels sprouts taste bad to some people also have health-giving benefits. I talked about tomatoes being bred to limit waste during tomato production, growth, transportation, and storage on the shelves, but sacrificing breeding for taste along the way. A lot of Honeycrisp apples go on the compost heap or in the landfill because they get bruised during production and transport, and they can't be sold. Adding more complications about uncertainties in climate fluctuations and producing enough to feed everyone. How do you manage all of these different outcomes, taste, waste, uncertainty, productivity, that sometimes are in direct contrast with one another? So I would say this is just one more reason why it's so hard to predict the future of food. One thing I do predict is that I don't see the end of cooking anytime soon. Food is love. We've talked about what is food from the beginning of class, and very rarely is it just fuel. In 1893, at the World's Fair in Chicago, the American Press Association asked writers to predict what they thought in 100 years, so 1993, what food might look like. And one writer, Mary Lease, predicted that humans would only eat synthetic food, liberating women from the drudgery of the kitchen, and that people would, quote, take in condensed from the rich loam of the earth the life force or germs now found in the heart of the corn, the kernel of the wheat, and in the luscious juices of the fruit. A small vial of this life form from the fertile bosom of Mother Earth will furnish men with substance for days, and thus the problems of cooks and cooking will be solved. So Mary Elizabeth Lease is a suffragette. She very much sympathizes with the millions of women drudging in the kitchen. This is a time before a lot of current kitchen technology was invented, like whisks and can openers and cans and the restaurant. So to some extent, we have achieved her future, but in a better way. We do have the option to buy prepared foods away from the home, and more people do. Limiting the problems of cooking, but we haven't stopped cooking. There are these trade-offs between convenience of feeding ourselves and cooking for care. So, and at the same time, the knowledge of how to cook, the availability of ingredients, and the context in which we cook. So have your cooking practices changed following the quarantine? Have you learned some new skills? Have you had more time for food preparation? Did you have to change what you made due to limited availability of some ingredients? I was actually busier than I've ever been during the quarantine, and my food practices definitely shifted as we did less home cooking and had more pre-prepared meals. But there's a reason why you still add an egg to your cake mix and bake a birthday cake for a loved one, because food is never just, rarely. It's rarely just food. What about the end of eating with this meal and a pill concept? In 1944, Women's Club in Missouri held a notorious dinner where they ate a variety of meal pills. The ladies were happy to play future, but record shows that after all the tasting of the pills, they sat down to have a cup of coffee and a plate of sandwiches. And so I don't see the end of eating either. We've talked about foods in terms of taste and flavor, sight and smell and hearing. So when you think about it, it's pretty amazing that so much TV is made about food when you only get one or maybe two senses of the food that we see and hear on the show. So there must be something else behind our seemingly insatiable desire to eat vicariously, exploring history and relationships, science and art together, travel and culture, There's so many experiences wrapped up in the act of eating as we feed both the body and the soul. Thank you for your attention today. I look forward to seeing you again next week, and think about what your own food future might be like. That's it.